Good afternoon and greetings, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and guests. My name is James Felton III, Vice President for the Division of Inclusive Excellence here at the College of New Jersey. I'd like to welcome you to the culminating event of what has been an impressive Black History Month at TCNJ. This month would not have been possible without the support and participation of many of our collaborators, including the amazing Dr. Piper Williams and all the great faculty in the African American Studies Department, Judy Cook in Instructional Design, the School of Education, the Political Science Department, the Associate Vice President Dave Muha and his incredible team in the Office of Communications, Marketing, and Brand Management, the Offices of Media Technology and Support Services, and Campus Police for a great Pan-African flag raising ceremony, the Black Student Union, the NAACP, Reverend Jamal Johnson, Lynette Harris, Marvin Carter, Associate Vice President Kerry Tillett, and last but certainly not least, President Foster. Once again, thank you all for your efforts. I want to inform you that this session is being recorded. Also, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. At this time, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. is an intellectual who speaks to the complex dynamics of the American experience. His most well-known books, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In the Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, take a wide look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges of our democracy that we face as a democracy. He's an American critic in the tradition of James Baldwin and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In his writings, the country's complexities, vulnerabilities, and the opportunities for hope come into full view. Hope, that is, and one of his favorite quotes from W.E.B. Du Bois, not hopeless, but a bit unhopeful. He is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies, a program he first became involved with, shaping as a doctoral candidate in religion at Princeton University. He is the former president of the American Academy of Religion. His books on religion and philosophy include An Uncommon Faith, A Pragmatic Approach to the Study of African American Religion, A Very Short Introduction, and Exodus, Religion and Race and a Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize. Glaude is also the author of 2 edited volumes and many influential articles about religion for academic journals. He has also written for the likes of the New York Times and Time Magazine. Known to be a conveyor of conversations and debates, Glaude takes care to engage fellow citizens of all ages and backgrounds, from young activists to fellow academics, journalists, and commentators and followers on Twitter, in dialogue about the direction of this nation. His scholarship and his sense of self as a public intellectual are driven by a commitment to think carefully with others in public. Glaude's most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was released on June 30th, 2020. Of Baldwin, Glaude writes, Baldwin's writing does not bear witness to the glory of America. It reveals the country's sins and the illusion of innocence that blinds us to the reality of others. Baldwin's vision requires a confrontation with our history, slavery, Jim Crow segregation with whiteness to overcome its hold on us. Not to posit the greatness of America, but to establish the ground upon which to imagine the country anew. Some like to describe Glaude as the quintessential Morehouse man, having left his home in Moss Point, Mississippi at age 16 to begin studies at the HBCU. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and a PhD in religion from Princeton University. He began his teaching career at Bowdoin College. In 2011, he delivered Harvard's Du Bois Lecture Series. In 2015, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from Colgate University, delivering commencement remarks titled Turning Our Backs, that was recognized by the New York Times as one of the best commencement speeches of the year. He is a columnist for Time Magazine and an MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House with Nicolle Wallace, of which I watch both very faithfully. He also regularly appears on Meet the Press on Sundays. Glaude hosts the podcast AAS 21, recorded at Princeton University, and Stanhope Hall, the African American Studies Department's home. TCNJ, I present to you Dr. Eddie Glaude.
So thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I really appreciate being here with you. I want to thank you and Sister Tillett for your welcome. I'm just trying to make sure everyone muted. For welcoming me here. TCNJ is like home. I want to just acknowledge first my brilliant partner, Dr. Winifred Brown Glaude, without whom I don't know what I would do. She is the brains in this household. So I'm thankful that she's here, and I'm thankful that she's a part of the TCNJ community. I also want to thank, in some ways, my extended family by virtue of my lovely wife, brilliant wife, and that is, I want to thank Dr. Cassandra Jackson and Dr. Piper Williams and Dr. Judith Benna and Dr. Marla Jackson and Dr. Leanne Francis, all of whom have made our lives here so much better. Thank you so much. So I don't have a lot of time. I want to just jump straight into this. Here we go. I found myself recently, and it was prompted by a request, oddly enough, by Oprah Winfrey's book club, thinking about Alain Locke's 1925 essay, Enter the Negro, a manifesto of sorts for the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance, as you know, was this extraordinary expression of cultural Black genius in the early part of the 20th century. It was one among many Black cultural movements across the country. We know there was a Renaissance in Chicago and in Pittsburgh and the like, but Harlem kind of captures our imagination, and rightly so, I think. The book club asked me, they wanted me to suggest a few books that were central to the period. And of course, I mentioned Locke's anthology, The New Negro, and Jean Toomer's Cain, and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. But Locke's essay kept attracting my attention, not so much because of his powerful declaration of a new phase of Black life, his account of a new kind of Black subject with a maturing aesthetic and a cultural voice stepping on the scene, and how the material shifts in African-American life unleashed by mass migration from the rural countryside to cities, from the South to the North, made all of this possible. And of course, he's querying what it all might have meant for American democracy. I was more interested in a formulation that actually served as the backdrop of Locke's analysis, what preceded, in some ways, the emergence of the so-called New Negro, what occasioned such a declaration in the first place. My eyes kept coming back to this passage, quote, and Locke writes, "The old Negro had long become more of a myth than a man. The old Negro, we must remember, was a creature of moral debate and historical controversy. He has been a stock figure perpetrated as an historical fiction, partly in innocent sentimentalism, partly in deliberate reactionism. So for generations in the mind of America, the Negro has been more of a formula than a human being, a something to be argued about, condemned or defended, to be kept down or in his place or helped up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social boogie or a social burden," end quote. With this view in mind, even Black people, Locke suggested, have come to see themselves, quote, in the distorted perspective of a social problem, end quote. And it reminded me of W.E. Du Bois's words in The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, quote, "To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I seldom answer a word," end quote. So Locke commends the New Negro against the backdrop of a host of assumptions about Black people that have shaped how this country treats them and how this country imagines itself. Or to put the point more directly, this vision of the new Black subject makes sense only if we are to understand a certain view of white people in this country, how they are valued more than others. and how that valuation dictates the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. The new Negro, and this is what strikes me, I think, is an attempt to break free from the stranglehold of assumptions about Black people that justify a society organized to value white people more than others. As Locke put it, quote, "The Negro today wishes to be known for what he is, even in his faults and shortcomings, and scorns a craven and precarious survival at the price of seeming to be what he is not. He resents being spoken for as a social ward or minor, and to being regarded a chronic patient for the sociological clinic, the sick man of American democracy," end quote. Now, many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance remain highly regarded today, but I must admit the idea of American democracy Locke imagined has yet to come to fruition. We still live in a society where some among us believe that this country must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe, where the stock assumptions about Black people continue to circulate. I believe what happened on January 6th was the latest expression of this view. A mob of mostly white men and women sacked the Capitol. They roamed the halls of the Congress and declared they were here, quote, "to stop the steal," end quote, to act as patriots on behalf of a country in peril. And what was revealed, at least to me, was a clear expression of a different register of civic expression, a different kind of citizenship, of those who have the right to dissent and who can claim ownership of this country, while the rest of us are expected to shut up and be grateful. In 1925, Locke asserted, implicitly at least, that the presence of the new Negro challenged the underlying logic of whiteness that threatened to swallow whole our democracy. And here we are in 2021, grappling still with that same serpent. Now, to my mind, Black History Month isn't simply about a detailed listing of Black excellence or examples of Black achievement. Of course, it can be that, but it is also an occasion to examine the deep contradiction that rests at the heart of the country, one rooted in the idea that white people ought to matter more than others, and the lies we tell ourselves to protect us from the implications of such a view. Now, what is clear to me, and January 6th, I think, is the evidence, and what has happened since January 6th as well, is that the American idea is in trouble. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today we confront the ugliness of who we are. And that ugliness isn't just about who occupies the White House or murderous police officers or loud racists screaming horrible things. It involves in part the millions of Americans who feel that their country has turned its back on them, that the browning of America represents for them a distinct decline. Some sacked the Capitol because they believed the election was stolen. They believed that only white voters matter. For many, with their white militia paraphernalia, this was a riot fueled by white fear and white resentment and white grievance and white hatred. And what has been revealed is that the ideology of white supremacy threatens once again to swallow whole this fragile experiment in democracy. We've been here before. We've had a chance to be otherwise, and the nation doubled down on its ugliness. You know, these moments where the country finds itself at a crossroads, where it has to choose who it will actually be, who we actually are. I'm thinking about the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, what historians call the second founding. Here we see the formation of the modern US nation state, the passage of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, where we see in some ways, at least ideally, our notion of citizenship untethered from an idea of color. We get in some ways the articulation of a full sense of due process, right? But what did we get in response to this effort to reimagine the US nation state? What did we get in response to this idea of including those who were former slaves into the body politic, giving them the full rights and burdens of citizenship? Well, we got Jim Crow in the South. Frederick Douglass lived long enough to see Abraham Lincoln sign the Emancipation Proclamation into law and witness the state of Mississippi pass the first Jim Crow law. He would call those who supported Plessy versus Ferguson, right, the apostles of forgetfulness. At the moment in which we reached for a different way of being as a nation, we saw those called the redeemers. We saw those embrace redemption and lost cause. Right, the moment we reached to be a truly multiracial democracy, the country doubled down on its ugliness. It doubled down on the belief that white people mattered more than others. Wow. The same thing happened in the mid-20th century. The Black freedom struggle demanded broad-based inclusion. Historians often refer to this period as the second Reconstruction, an attempt to fulfill the broken promises of the first. What do we get in response to everyday ordinary people risking their lives in the streets? What did we get in response to all of those who gave their lives for full citizenship for Black folk, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, we got the election of Richard Nixon. When the bottom half of Dr. King's face was blown off in the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, what did we get in response? Not an embrace of his agenda, but we got the election of Richard Nixon and calls for law and order. We put in place the building blocks of what would become the carceral state. We got the tax revolt in California, which laid the foundation for the shredding of the social safety net, where you saw everyday ordinary Americans claiming the tyranny of big government, taking away hard-earned money from white folks and giving it to undeserving, lazy Black and brown folk. And of course, the last piece of major legislation published in the Great Society was the Fair Housing of 1968. And we get, by 1980, just 12 years later, the election of Ronald Reagan to undo it all. And even in 2008, with the election of Barack Obama, we get folk like William Bennett saying that no more excuses. America has turned a corner. We finally put this race issue behind us. We got folk claiming that America is now new. What did we get in response? We got the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby decision. We got voting out voter ID laws in places like Texas and Georgia and North Carolina and Wisconsin. We got voter suppression. We got the vitriol of the Tea Party. And of course, we elected Donald Trump. At every turn, when we face the kind of moral reckoning we now face, we have doubled down on our ugliness. At every turn, when a new America is about to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around its neck, choking the life out of the child. I'm reminded of that extraordinary moment in Jesmyn Ward's amazing novel, Sing Unburied Sing, when Kayla, the young baby, the young girl, confronts the tree of the dead. And all of those who have suffered as a result of the country's refusal to come to terms with this contradiction at his heart, this paradox at the heart, at the center of American democracy. She says, oh, one long brown line rippling like water, and then I see it. He ascends the tree like the white snake. He undulates along the trunk to the branches where he rolls out along one again in a recline, and the branches are full. They're full with ghosts, 2 or 3, all the way to the top, to the feathered leaves. There are women and men and boys and girls, some of them near to babies. They crouch looking at me, black and brown, and the closest near babies smoke white. None of them reveal their deaths, but I see it in their eyes. Their great black eyes. They perch like birds, but look as people. They speak with their eyes. He raped me and suffocated me until I died. I put my hands up and he shot me 8 times. She locked me in the shed and starved me to death while I listened to my babies playing with her in the yard. They came in my cell in the middle of the night and they hung me. They found I could read and they dragged me out to the barn and gouged my eyes. Before they beat me, still I was sick. And he said I was an abomination. And Jesus say, suffer little children to let her go. And he put me under the water and I couldn't breathe. Eyes blink as the sun blazes and winks below the forest line so that the ghosts catch the color, reflect the red. The sun making scarlet plumage of the clothes they wear, rags and breeches, t-shirts, tignons and fedoras and hoodies. Are dead. Those who have been lost because we have refused to confront who we actually are. And we know that the election in November didn't settle any of this. I pray that we do not trade one fantasy for another, that somehow the election affirms America's inherent goodness and puts a grateful republic, back to sleep. Presidential elections alone, no matter how momentous, do not settle the question of who we take ourselves to be. The answer to that question will emerge in what we do now. Will we finally leave behind this idea of white America that Locke referenced? Can we release ourselves into a new way of being in the world? Can we finally give up this idea of whiteness that requires the old Negro? This takes us to the heart of the vexing issue of race and democracy in this country. That America's original sin was not slavery, in my view. It wasn't the genocide of Native peoples. Those are consequences. America's original sin is the price of the ticket. It is the belief that white people matter more than others. And that belief, combined with greed, has distorted and disfigured our democratic way of life and has left bodies in its wake. We have to tell ourselves a different story about who we are. We can no longer tell ourselves a story about our American virtue that secures our innocence. And here I notice an interesting connection between Alain Locke and James Baldwin. Baldwin rejected, no matter if you think he's right, but he rejected Richard Wright's native son because the character of Bigger Thomas bore the imprimatur of those assumptions that Locke so brilliantly delineated. Assumptions that had little to do with the actual lives of Black people. Assumptions that said more about white people than they revealed about anything else. Baldwin loathed the sentimentality of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and saw Bigger Thomas as the flip side of the same coin. As he put it in Notes of a Native Son, sentimentality is the mask of cruelty. The point is similar to Locke's, that the view of Black people is one that is bound up with a certain view of white people, that the value gap requires that Black folk be considered as a kind of ward, as a kind of victim. Now for Baldwin, quote, "The country will not change until it re-examines itself and discovers what it really means by freedom. And that will involve, among other things, telling itself the truth, or better, no longer lying to itself about what it has done and what it is doing." In fact, Baldwin insisted that the country confront the lie that sustains its innocence. As he put it in The Fire Next Time, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the stories that we told ourselves to secure our innocence. In Nothing Personal, an essay he wrote in 1964, he put it this way: "We are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little." I love that line. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. Baldwin writes, "We live by lies." And not only about race, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our heart, end quote. It's hard to admit, but we must. The United States has never been a beacon of virtue. It is not an example of democracy achieved. Hell, the late political theorist Judith Sklar said America didn't become a genuine democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that was generous. America is not the shining city on the hill. We tell ourselves these stories in order to protect us from what we've done. Baldwin understood that our problems in the United States go beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the rot at the heart of the matter. And this requires that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred, at least in my view, tell the truth, so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. Understand by asking ourselves the question, why was there a need in the first place to announce a new Negro, or to ask or to demand a new kind of Black subjectivity? Because we were challenging a world saturated by assumptions about who ought to be valued more than others. This, I believe, to echo Baldwin, is the American situation in relief, the root of our unadmitted sorrow, as he put it. We are trapped in a history that we refuse to know but carry within ourselves. right? The terrors and panic we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. The nation actively evades confronting this gap. That we actively invade confronting this gap locks us into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of new world Eden refuse to grow up. That's what I read January 6th as. A refusal to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. Imagine being stuck in Never Never Land forever. Forever lost boys and lost girls refusing to be held accountable, refusing to take on responsibility. I can't help but connect this insight to what has happened over the last 4 years and over the last month or so. Americans refusing to grow up, reveling in the fantasy that ours must be a white nation in the vein of old Europe, with not a hint of irony at CPAC right today, pushing a gold statue like the golden calf around CPAC, a golden statue of Donald Trump. Seems to me, it feels like a suppressed terror and panic lurks beneath the surface of the rants and hatreds, that the seams are unraveling and revealing the true monstrosity hidden underneath a cheap-ass MAGA hat and t-shirt. In 1962, Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. There he wrote, quote, "The effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more." For Baldwin, and for us, I believe, we must deal with, quote, "what words hide and what they reveal," end quote. And this is all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories obscure the horrors and panic that are a result of what we've done. Stories that ensure our innocence and our inherent goodness. Telling the truth in America, especially in dark times like these, requires a certain kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety, comfort, and protection for the order of things. It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release ourselves into a new way of being together. And this will entail at times a withering criticism of the past that haunts and constrains, a scathing critique of our self-conception. We have to look that tree of death squarely in the face. Baldwin insisted that we ask the hard question: how shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? How can we leave behind sentimentality and bury the view that desperately needs Black folk to be the sick men and women of American democracy? Baldwin, like Locke, understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involves what we tell ourselves about Black and white people, right? And we have witnessed over these so many years, over generations, the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view in terms of our dispositions and practices. As Baldwin put it, we must, and I think we must follow his words today if we are to survive our own darkness. We must describe us to ourselves as we are now, and we must aim for a kind of perception, to echo Henry James, at the pitch of passion as we do so. This is a challenge Americans must take up. We have to finally grow up as a nation. The country stands on a knife's edge. The background conditions that make our democracy possible have cracked. Americans have to dare to be otherwise, do everything in our power to break from the old frames that have us trapped in categories that blind us to the humanity of those around us. We have to live into a different way of being together. And that means, in my view, committing ourselves to building a country that affirms the dignity and sanctity of every human being, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their zip code or where they're from or who they love, their gender or ability. It involves what Dr. King called a revolution of value, a shift in what and who we value. We have to step outside of our comfort zones, tell ourselves the truth about our failures, and risk everything in this moment to do something bold and visionary. Stop fighting on the old battlefield. Shift the ground beneath our feet. As Baldwin said just a year before his death, quote, "We are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not white, this world. It is not black either. The future of this world depends on everyone in this room, and that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which can now not bear the weight of reality." Unquote. Baldwin also said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Such powerful words for our country today and for us. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges this time. What will be your moonshot, TCNJ? How will you imagine your university as a space that actually recognizes and reflects the beauty, the brilliance, the diversity of this country? What will be your moonshot, or will you tinker around the edges again? We can't aspire for unity and leave the old frame intact. The costs are too high. We must shake loose from the shibboleths of the past and their gods, and remembering that no matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility now. We cannot turn away from our responsibilities now. We must risk everything to finally put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. And that will be hard work. But as Baldwin says, human beings are at once miracles and disasters. We have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we are. But if we show up and risk ourselves in this moment, we at least have a chance for a miracle. As Amanda Gorham said in her poem on Inauguration Day, and I'm paraphrasing, she says, she told us to recognize, to see the light. And she told us to be the light. If we can see it and be it, then we may be able to announce not just a new phase for Black people, to echo Elaine Locke, but maybe we can announce a new America, the first genuinely multiracial democracy in the modern world. It all depends on what we do now in this moment. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Glaude. At this time, we will entertain any questions from the community. We want to remind you that there is a Q&A feature. You can place your questions there. And all speaker ones.
I didn't want to talk for a whole hour.
All right, we've got a couple questions coming in. Someone said they could listen to you speak for hours, so that's all right. So first question, in the wake of January 6th, I would like to know your take on the people running the CPAC in Orlando and the statue. It is as if they are continuing the January 6th agenda. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. One of the things I tried to do in the talk is to give us some historical coordinates, like what What are some previous historical moments that offer us some kind of insight into our current moment? And it's really predicated upon this basic intuition that we've been here before, right? That the nation has faced an opportunity to be otherwise. And so I turned our attention to Reconstruction. At the moment in which the nation literally is trying to do its first works over, and thinking about incorporating the formerly enslaved into the body politic, what do we get in response? Well, we get what historians call the redeemers. And the redeemers are the members of the planter class and those in the North who hold noxious racist views. And they are trying to, in some ways, build a political coalition alongside of their commitment with the ideology of white supremacy to undo, right, radical Reconstruction. And they win. Because not only do we get in response to radical Reconstruction, Jim Crow in the South, we get convict leasing, another form of slavery, where literally the state is deployed, the criminal justice system is deployed with police to conscript Black labor to help build cities like Birmingham. What else did we get in response? We got the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism. I mean, I mentioned that because we tend to exceptionalize the South. But as Malcolm X says, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South. And so this idea of Anglo-Saxonism, of this hierarchy of the races, with Anglo-Saxons being at the top, constructing a history that would then inform Aryanism that would, of course, be at the heart of Nazism. What do we get? That ideology becomes the basis of America's imperial ambition. So at the very moment in which we're consolidating a racial regime in the South with Jim Crow law, we're annexing places like the Philippines and Guam, bringing millions of people of color under our rule. Now, why do I make this historical example, Brother James, right? Because what we're seeing with CPAC, what we saw with Kevin McCarthy and Josh Hawley and others, they're the new redeemers. They're the ones who are trying to resist the birth of a new America, to cleave to this idea that we must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. To give you even more concrete of an example, on the floor of the Senate, as the senators were trying to certify the November election, Ted Cruz invoked the Compromise of 1877 as a frame for resolving the conflict. He hearkened back to the very decision that allowed the Redeemers to win, that ushered in the end of radical Reconstruction and the beginning of white supremacist terror in the South in particular and across the country. So that's how I would describe them. We need to name them for who they are. They're the new Redeemers. That's who they are.
Thank you. Next question. How do we start telling ourselves the truth in order to overcome racism?
Bear witness, to be bold and courageous. Tell the truth at TCNJ. Tell the truth right where you are. What does it mean? What does it matter if some of us have spent a career achieving a certain kind of status in these sorts of places, and then we mute ourselves, and then we're quiet? What the hell are you there for? Why are you there in the first place? Oh, well, if you want to be honest, you're there for yourself. Okay, we're cool with that, right? So part of what we have to do is tell the truth. Baldwin writes in Many Thousands Gone, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that we have to make ourselves blank in order to wash away your guilt. It's almost as if we have to leave the particularity of who we are and our history at the door as a precondition for our entree into American society. We can't do that anymore. So we have to bear witness, tell the truth when we can. And what I've been trying to do in the short period of time that I've had these platforms is to really, in certain ways, tell the history of the country as it is, to lay it bare. To put it in a different kind of language, we all need to be poets, which means we all need to bear witness to what is happening in this country. And that doesn't mean we have to be rageful. It doesn't mean that we have to be the angry person of color, right? It just simply means we have to tell the truth. And that will open the door, at least to my mind, for us imagining a different way of being together.
Next question. At what point do you think America will stop doubling down on racism as a result of the progress and change that takes place, particularly as it pertains to the need to make needed adjustments to elementary education regarding America's history?
I don't know. I'm not even confident in this moment. Our history doesn't suggest we will do well. So I can't say with any certainty when. I do know it's in our hands, though, to echo Toni Morrison from her Nobel lecture. It's in our hands. We can't allow the country, I think, to double down on its ugliness now. We can't be complicit. We have to continue to fight for a bolder, more just country. So, you know, I'm a country boy from the Gulf Coast. I grew up with a lot of hurricanes. And, you know, the front end of a hurricane is rough. So it causes all this damage, the wind, it springs tornadoes and the like. And then you get this calm. It's called the eye of the storm. And it allows you to come out and assess the damage. We're in the eye of the storm, but we need to understand the tail's coming. And the tail is as rough as the front end. So I don't know how we will respond. I just know we got some difficult days ahead.
Another question. If Donald Trump is elected in 2024, what is your prospect for this nation and for the future?
It's a wrap. Democracy, we've already seen the erosion of democratic norms and democratic institutions over the 4 years that he was in office. It was just simply graft and greed and corruption and incompetence. There are over 500,000 people dead because of that incompetence, right? We were told at the beginning of this pandemic that if we didn't do the right things, we would see upward to 200,000 dead. And we were horrified by those numbers coming out of Dr. Fauci's mouth. Now we're over 500, over 500,000 in less than a year. I mean, we haven't hit a year yet. And that has everything to do with incompetence. On top of that, we saw literally the implementation of this effort to dismantle the administrative state. That this ideology of that holds big government under suspicion evidenced itself very clearly in the way in which Republicans govern, not just Trump, but Republicans govern. And we know that the result has been mass death. So if Trump is elected in 2024, we seal the fate of American democracy, because what has been revealed over the last 4 years is that this country isn't guaranteed. That in the blink of an eye, one could find oneself in an authoritarian and fascistic set of arrangements. We saw its elements. We're still seeing its features. So we must be careful and diligent. This is not over yet.
On a simplistic level, can you encapsulate your view of what we as adults of all colors need to do to grow up?
Oh, Lord, that's so hard, because I'm still trying desperately. Baldwin, I wrote this book, Begin Again, and thank God for Dr. Brown Glaude, who endured my craziness and my silences and me being in my cave and not paying attention to the world as I manically tried to finish it. But the book I almost didn't survive it, because Baldwin is an exacting companion because of what he demands. He believes in the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life isn't worth living. But he gives it a different kind of inflection, because he holds the view that the messiness of the world, Brother James, is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. So we have to deal with this. We have to deal with who we are, right? We have to deal with our own wounds and our own trauma and our own pain as a precondition to say anything about the world as such. So I found myself grappling with the fact that I'm this vulnerable little boy, who still has daddy issues. And as soon as I started grappling with that, suddenly the sentences start jumping on the page, So what does it mean to grow up? As Baldwin says, you got to run towards your fear. You got to be clear about your pain and your suffering, because that pain, that suffering is the bridge. But as long as we are, shall we say, retreating into a kind of willful ignorance, as long as we think that safety and security are the values, right? We will engage in these ongoing strategies of evasion so that we can stay in Never Never Land. So growing up requires a confrontation with the ugliness of who we are, of who you are, who I am, as a precondition to enter into the world differently. Remember how he ends The Fire Next Time. He says, if we, the relatively conscious whites and relatively conscious blacks, join together like lovers, perhaps we can achieve our country, right? But we run past that phrase, like lovers. What does he mean there, right? He's not talking about King's agape there. He's talking about eros. He's talking about philia. He's talking about that experience of love where one is vulnerable, right? Fragile, right? Open. So we have to deal with who we are as individuals. And that becomes the basis for dealing with who we are as a nation, it seems to me.
You might have already alluded to this next question, but specifically, what do you believe TCNJ's moonshot should be?
I wouldn't dare to suggest that. One of the things I loathe is that people helicopter into environments and try to dictate what those environments are, right? I don't know the particular, even though I have an extended community of folk, TCNJ is Dr. Brown Glaude's world, right? And I know she has an answer to that question. And I don't want to step on those toes because I know the consequences. You hear Jamaican patois already. But I think the question that you have to ask yourselves, like we all have to ask ourselves in whatever environment that we're in, what constitutes a truly just TCNJ? How do we move from philanthropic and charitable models to constitutive models? And what do I mean by that, Brother James? Oftentimes we think of white supremacy in relation to the loud racists. Those are the easy people. The most difficult aspect of white supremacy, to my view, and I think this is informing Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail as well, is this philanthropic approach that racial justice and racial equality is a charitable enterprise, something that white people possess to give to others. And so we have to break this model, because then that leads, okay, I'm gonna give you a little quota here, a little bit there, but you don't see diversity and equity and inclusion as a constitutive value of who you take yourself to be as an institution, as a campus, as a workplace, right? So what we have to do is kind of break this model, or break the back of this approach that assumes that we are just gonna do a little bit here and there, and see diversity, equity, inclusion as constitutive of who we take ourselves to be. And what that looks like in its detail at the level of admissions, at the level of faculty, at the level of administration, at the level of board, at the level of staff. We need to build a university, a college that actually looks like the world in which we exist in. And what might that commitment entail? What are the metrics to measure it, and what to hold ourselves accountable to it? Not just to give lip service to virtue signal. That's the beginning of an answer that I've been trying to work out at Princeton, not necessarily at TCNJ.
But sounds applicable to us as well, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Without a doubt, the next few years will shape the future of our democracy. What is the most critical and effective action we can take on a local level and or national level to support equality in our systems and government? How important is it for us to all stay engaged and active?
The latter part, it is critical. Our democracy is on life support. That's how dangerous the last 4 years have been. Culminating in January 6th. It's on life support. I don't want us to trade one fantasy for another. Right? The fantasy of Donald Trump for the fantasy of the Biden-Harris administration. Right? Much of the changes that need to take place in this country must take place at the local level. When we talk about defund the police, we're not talking about abolition. Some of us may be making that argument, but that's an argument to have. But defund the police is actually about budgeting your values. What does it mean for the municipality of Ewing to allocate X amount of money to policing and carcerality as opposed to mental health services, job training, and the like? What does it mean that we have municipalities like New York and Los Angeles spending exponential amounts of its budget on policing and carcerality and not enough on education and social services? What happens, for example, when in New York, Rochester, New York, a family's having trouble with their young 9-year-old daughter who's showing signs of suicidality? They call 911, they deploy the police handcuffs the baby, and then it ends up pepper spraying her in the backseat of a car. What happens when you think about in Philadelphia, when Walter Wallace's mother called 911 because he was having a mental health crisis? They deployed the police, and then she ends up having to bury her baby, her grown son. So defund the police has everything to do with local activism. How do we begin to talk about policing in Ewing and Trenton and in Lawrenceville and in Princeton and the like? How are we talking about education? When we talk about education, we know that that is in part a local and state issue. We have to organize on the ground to begin to imagine being together differently, building a kind of new public infrastructure of care where healthcare and education and the living wage and safety and security are its key components. So I think we need to begin to organize in our particular municipalities, in our local spaces around, particularly around criminal justice reform and police reform. We need to push our schools. We know what's happening in Ewing, and we know what's happening in Lawrenceville. We need to begin to hold boards of trustees boards of education accountable in very specific sorts of ways. At the national level, right, we need to understand who the Republican Party actually is. We need to understand what they've done over the last 40 years, and we need to understand the Democrats who have been complicit in it all. This is not just a Republican story. Republicans didn't pass the crime bill. Republicans didn't pass welfare reform, quote unquote, right? We have to shift the balance of power, change the center of gravity. And so it's going to require bold, visionary action. We're already seeing the debates around student loan relief. We're already seeing the debates about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Look, Black folk, it took us 400 years to get to $7.25 an hour. We started out at zero, 400 years. So we need to begin to think boldly and creatively at the national level and at the local and state level. That's my short answer. Relatively short answer. You're on mute, Brother James.
Jose, if you oblige us, we have just a couple more questions.
Sure, sure.
How can older generations recognize their own bias when they have thought this their whole entire life?
I don't know. It's a hard question. You know, it's like, you know, I tend to avoid implicit bias talk because it absolves people of responsibility all too often. I usually talk about habit formation. You know, you can smoking for 20 years, 30 years, and you're addicted to the nicotine and the tar, but you can figure out about how to change your external environments that can help you break the habit. So one of the things that we have to do for our older brothers and sisters who are committed to a certain understanding of Blackness and whiteness, who are committed to the value gap, as it were, is begin to change their external environments, right? You know, Dr. King was very clear that he couldn't change everybody's heart, but he wanted laws to keep people from lynching us, right? So we have to do this internal work, but in the process, we can begin to do that by having an impact on our external environment. I want to say we need to begin to impact how we live together. That's going to involve how neighborhoods are constituted, right? It's going to impact, you know, we're going to have to engage in zoning laws. We know what the hell Princeton has been doing in terms of its property taxes assessment, right? What they're doing to old, long-standing Black communities as gentrification is moving down Witherspoon Street, right? I know what Princeton has been doing, right? And so part of what we have to do is understand that policy, right, will be the conditions under which some people will change their orientation, or they may not. But long as, you know, I only have a finite amount of civic energy. I want to build a world in which those noxious views have no advantage, no quarter to breathe. I may not change their minds, but I damn sure want to build a world that that's better for the majority of Americans. And I can give some more specific examples, but we got more questions.
So next question. Thank you, Dr. Glaude. I
Sure.
love the question, what will TCNJ do? I work with people who identify as white, who overestimate their progressiveness or quote unquote wokeness. And this makes it almost impossible to actually make real change. This is exhausting for Black people who work here. What advice do you have for those committed to the work of anti-racism?
Do the work. We have to do the work. Figure out how to replenish, right? Figure out how to replenish. Create the conditions under which we all can grow, right? In this work. It is exhausting. You know, Jimmy Baldwin used to have this, he said once at a congressional hearing with Betty Shabazz that he was skeptical of white liberals. And he said, I'm skeptical of anyone who wants to do something for me as opposed to with me. We have to shift the axis of how we work. So in doing the work, as Leon Crawford says, we have to organize, we have to organize, we have to organize, right? And we have to engage in self-care, because this is a long distance race, right? It might not happen in our lifetime. So you got to find those moments to replenish so that you can re-enter the fray.
We'll entertain just a couple more questions. What is your why and what are your aspirations?
What is my why? That's such an interesting question. It's a way of asking about my calling. Why? Ever since I can remember remembering, I have believed and thought that I'm supposed to do something powerful in the world. Now you must understand that I'm saying this as a country boy from the coast of Mississippi, born in Moss Point. I've had this sense that Moss Point was just the kind of beginning. And I've been trying to figure out what that why is, as we all do when we think we have a calling, right? And so it is in part to bring my skill sets and all of its variety to bear on the problems of men and women, to try in the short time that I'm here before I return to dust to help make this a better and more just world. That's my why. At a broad level, at a general level, at a political level. But there's also this thing that, you know, how can I put this, Brother James? It's like, I got something in my head that's like Coltrane's, you know, giant steps. You know, there's something that I'm trying to figure out in my living and in my doing, that as I begin to play it, you know, I want folk like the pianist who just heard Coltrane's introduction to giant steps and doesn't know what the hell to do. Flummoxed by the expansive creativity on display in that moment. I tell myself this all the time, just as I tell young people this all the time. The world tries to make you small. The question is, will you let it? Take giant steps. And so at the political level, at the general level, I just gave you a sense of vocation. At the personal level, in terms of my gut, that's my why. I'm trying to take giant steps in the world in the short time that I'm here.
I appreciate the Coltrane reference as well. I think that is probably a most apt question to end this presentation today. There were probably another 20 other questions in the chat. Again, I think I speak on behalf of the entire TCNJ community. We can listen to you all day. We are so thankful and gracious that you were able to join us this afternoon. We encourage everyone to continue to follow the work of Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. In his writings, as well as his commentary. And we thank you all again for a wonderful Black History Month celebration here at TCNJ. And with that, any final words, Dr. Glaude?
Stay safe, mask up, and we'll be together soon. But stay safe. Take care.
Thank you so much. That concludes our program. Thank you again.